Thank you very okay. Thank you, Janet, very much. Tonight is March 24th, 2025, and we'd like to welcome everyone to the free program of the Boynton Beach Historical Society. Tonight's speaker comes to us courtesy of a grant from the Florida Humanities Speakers Bureau. Dr. Leslie K. Poole is a writer and historian who has long been interested in the role of women in our state's environmental movement and how women were saving our national resources before they were even able to vote. We ask that you save your questions for the end of Dr. Poole's presentation tonight, and please be sure to complete the Florida Humanities survey for us. I give you Dr. Poole.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to make sure everyone can see the screen, okay? The PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, great. It's such a pleasure to be here. My thanks to the Boynton Beach Historical...
Do not see anything.
I'm sorry?
I can't see any of you. I don't know what I should do.
Can you see the PowerPoint screen that says welcome?
No, but don't slow down for me. It's probably just me. I only see names and I hear your voice, so I get to hear what you're talking about.
Well, you might log out and then come back into the meeting. That might help. But I am so not techie. I'm a historian. Put me in a room with dusty boxes of papers and old handwriting, and I'm good to go. So I'm sorry, I can't help. Maybe someone else has a suggestion? No? Okay.
If you're watching on your iPhone, perhaps try scrolling up. I noticed on my phone, the PowerPoint is at the top of the screen. I don't know if that helps or not.
Okay.
Janet, are you listening? Okay, sorry, Dr. Poole. Please go ahead.
All right, let's start again. Again, my thanks to the Boynton Beach Historical Society for having me here. And also the book is sponsored by the Florida Humanities Council, and I really appreciate their support and their help with bringing this program to many different communities as well. Tonight I'm going to be talking about my new book, Tracing Florida Journeys, and giving you a brief overview of some of the chapters that are in the book. Let me say from the very beginning, this has been a book I've been working on and thinking about for over 20 years. I'm a Florida history and literature nerd, buff, however you want to put it. And one of my favorite things to do is to read old accounts of Florida and then go back and retrace those journeys. So the thinking behind this book was to pick different travelers who had come through Florida during different periods of time with different motivations and in different parts of the state, and then go back and retrace the places that they had written about in their accounts. So there are many more travelers who came to Florida than are in my book, but they're all picked for a very specific reason. And tonight I'm going to go over a few of them, and we will take questions at the end. So if you have some questions, please submit them in the chat, I think, on the Zoom, and that will help us get there, okay? So here we go. So Florida's journeys. I'm going to begin tonight by talking about Jonathan Dickinson. He is an early account that we know. We have his written book, and you can see the picture here, called God's Protecting Providence. Jonathan Dickinson was on a boat called the Reformation that had left Jamaica, headed for the English colony in Philadelphia. Dickinson was an English Quaker during the colonial period, and while his family had huge holdings in Jamaica, he had decided it was time to take his wife, his 6-month-old son, and the people that he had enslaved with him and go back to Philadelphia. The boat left Jamaica in August of 1696 and got caught in low winds off of Cuba and separated from the other group of boats it was traveling with. Ultimately, they finally got into the Gulf Stream, but by then they were separated, and then they encountered a huge storm that wrecked them off the coast of Jupiter Inlet. Everybody survived the shipwreck, thankfully, but the next morning they woke up to a very scary situation. They realized that they were on the shore with a group of native people they were unfamiliar with, who had aligned themselves with the Spanish, who then owned Florida. And they realized that if they were identified as Englishmen, they would be killed, because that was part of the deal. The native people were patrolling the shore. So that one of their crew members spoke some Spanish, and so he did the negotiations with the local people, who actually in many ways were very scary to Dickinson. He saw the Florida coastline as a dangerous place. He saw these native people as very dangerous as well. But there were interesting periods where they fed them. They suckled his 6-month-old son when his wife's breast milk gave out. And then they escorted them 200 miles up the coast to St. Augustine. Some of that they were in a boat, and some of it they were walking up the coast. So it made for a fascinating account when he wrote his book about this. And he definitely saw God as the saving providence, that this is a story of religious faith and God saving them along the way. It's a really fascinating account. They were taken to what is, he called it Hoe Bay, at the south side of Jupiter Inlet. We don't really know what much of that coast looks like now, and we know that the native people had disappeared within 50 years of him visiting there. So this is really the only account of these native people. We can guess that this was probably where a large mound had been found, that had dated to the colonial period. And now, as you can see in this picture, it has a historical marker. Oh, excuse me. And a house had been built partly on it as well. So we know that he probably visited a native village there and stayed for a few days. And the local chief organized passage for him to head back up to St. Augustine. It took them from August until November 15th to reach St. Augustine, where they were given safekeeping and medical help and all by the Spanish authorities. And then they got on a boat and continued their journey up to Philadelphia. Dickinson becomes very prominent in Philadelphia. He's wealthy. He becomes the mayor of Philadelphia at one point as well. But this book is kind of how we remember him now. You can still follow some of his path. You can imagine most of the coast now has really lovely homes on it and hotels. But you can still find the markers for his expedition. You can see the lighthouse at Jupiter, which is near the Indian village where he would have come in. And I tried walking on this beach a few times, and it is not an easy walk. As a matter of fact, during Dickinson's trip, 5 people died of exposure on the beach at night near the end of the trip. And he complained a lot about the bugs, as you can imagine, at night on the coast. And many people would bury themselves in the sand to try to avoid those bugs as well. I think we all, if we've ever been out at night on the beach there, we know that that can happen. A few years later, William Bartram takes a trip to Florida, but deliberately. Almost 100 years after Dickinson, Bartram was a self-taught naturalist from Philadelphia again, and he and his father had traveled to Florida in the 1760s, and in between, William, or Billy, as his father referred to him, Billy had tried out a few business ventures, but they had not gone well. But what he could do is he could collect plants, and he loved plants, and he was an excellent artist, and his father recognized that as well. So Bartram starts off, he finds a rich plant collector in England. This was the thing. If you had money in England, you had your own private arboretum, and this collector agrees to pay Billy to travel through the southeastern colonies at the time and collect plant samples so that he could display them back in England and be the talk of the town. So Bartram leaves for Florida. He arrives in 1773, and he's in Florida through 1774 before he takes a long circuitous route all the way through what is now the southeastern United States. He's been memorialized in many areas with William Bartram Trail signs you may have seen. They're in North Carolina and Georgia and Florida. And so he's still remembered in that way. This is a picture of him from the National Portrait Gallery, and along with one of his drawings of Franklinia, which was a flower that he had found, and now it grows in his family home in Philadelphia. You can still visit it. After he got back, about 10 years later, he writes his account of this trip, much like Dickinson had done. And it has a really long name, as you can see here. But it's called within the academic circles just Bartram's Travels. It's published in Philadelphia in 1791 and then in London in 1792. And while it was well received in the States, well, yeah, it was the States by then, in England, it's a big hit. It's this wonderful exotic place that no one has seen. And the British poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were quite taken by the language there and actually used his descriptions, particularly of springs in Florida, as inspiration for some of their work as well. In his many travels, Bartram mostly traveled in a solitary way in a wooden boat with a sail that he would take up and down the St. Johns River, because that was really the best way to travel to the interior of Florida. But he takes a couple of interesting trips here that I just want to point out to you. In the top left is a picture of Payne's Prairie, which is now a state park located on the southern edge of Gainesville. Bartram went there with actually a party of traders, English traders, and they were the guests of a Seminole chief named Ahia. The English called him Cowkeeper. And they smoke a peace pipe. They stay with Ahia. They visit him for a while. And Ahia gives him a name, Puck Puggy, which means flower hunter or flower gatherer. And many people believe that it's this moniker that actually gave Bartram safe passage, that he had been recognized and appreciated by a Seminole chief who certainly would not have seen anything dangerous in Bartram. He was looking at flowers all the time, but gave him this kind of seal of approval. On the right is a picture, we don't know of who, but of a Seminole chief that Bartram drew. And it's so fascinating because while others, including Dickinson, saw the native people in Florida as very dangerous, Bartram was really fascinated. He saw them as really noble people, and he traded with them and spent time with them. And so you can read his book not only as a very accurate account of the natural systems in Florida, but also as an anthropological study of the different native people he met along the way, particularly when he moves into the Carolinas. It becomes really valuable for that. Let me mention that when Payne's Prairie was created as a state sanctuary, a state park, the land managers there were looking at the land and realized it needed to be restored. It had a lot of drainage ditches on it. It didn't look, like a natural Florida system. And they went back and read Bartram to give them an idea of what that landscape should look like. And they have Bartram Days once a year there now. They still celebrate him. Bartram saw wolves on Payne's Prairie, which I find a wonderful thing to imagine, but I don't think we'll ever see. On the bottom right is a picture of, well, you may not believe it, it's a little bit of an island, a rise along the banks of the St. Johns River. And we believe that this is where Bartram camped a couple of nights when he was traveling up the St. Johns River. He here writes about his encounter with alligators, and he names it Battle Lagoon. And he says the alligators attacked his boat and tried to grab the fish he was trying to catch for dinner. He describes them lining up together to eat fish as they come up the St. Johns River. For years, biologists really poo-pooed Bartram. They thought his writing was way too flowery, way too sweet. And as you can see, his pictures of alligators are, not so accurate. They're kind of fanciful, kind of more like a dragon. But we now know that this is actually a crocodilian feeding behavior. They actually do line up like that when there are big runs of fish. That's been observed down in South America. So in many ways, Bartram has been redeemed over the years by scientists who begin to realize he was a pretty excellent and accurate naturalist as well. While he was in Florida, he described more than 600 species, some for the very first time. The Franklinia is on the left, and on the right is Bartram's Ixia, which is a really interesting story. Bartram saw this flower, wrote about it, described it, but it wasn't seen again until the 1930s. So again, some botanists thought, he was kind of making stuff up, but now once it was rediscovered, apparently he was just in the right place at the right time to see it. So now it's actually commercially produced up in North Florida. But I love that story, and I love the flower. I think it's really beautiful. John James Audubon comes after Bartram. He comes to Florida, and he has a very specific want and need. He needs new birds. He has been in England and in the northeastern United States trying to sell subscriptions to his etchings of American birds. And he has styled himself as the American woodsman. You can see with his long hair, and he liked to wear fringed leather jackets, carry a gun around, and give this aura that he was the great outdoorsman. But what he came to Florida for was to find new birds for his subscribers. So he was trying to make some money. And as you may know, these are life-size pictures of birds. So it was a very interesting process. He starts off in the St. Johns River in 1831 in the autumn, and looks around and writes back to his wife and says, well, I don't know about all the flowery writings of Mr. Bartram, because I'm not, this is not what I expected. He was very disappointed in the Upper St. Johns area. He saw it as buggy and muddy, and he really was not happy until he finally caught a ship that took him down to the Florida Keys. And that for him was his nirvana. He finally found the Florida birds, the wading birds, the ones with the tropical exquisite colors that would help him to fill another volume of his book. He also catches a boat that takes him all the way down to the Dry Tortugas. And he manages to get there right during bird nesting season. So he's very happy once he gets into South Florida as well. He goes out with local people who take him on tours, and he gets to visit with not just looking for birds, but also meeting the local people. Now, we always think of Audubon in the sense of saving birds, but you should know that during this time period, he didn't have telephoto lenses or cameras or very good telescopes. So their method of being able to create a drawing of a bird was to literally kill them. And he killed maybe thousands, certainly hundreds of them while he was in Florida. And he did this because he wanted to find the perfect specimen that they would then put wires inside of and stand up to pose. And then he would draw from that pose. He also had an artist with him who was in charge of drawing the background for the birds as well. And that makes for really interesting historical looking. Some of the sites are really fascinating to see these drawings there. If you haven't seen them, there's a wonderful exhibition going on right now at the Daytona Beach Museum of Arts and Science that has the 52 birds that Audubon saw in Florida. And you can see them on display there now. And they were very large pictures, very large etchings. You can see here, I was trying to help you see the sizing of them as well. He had to make the flamingo bend over in order to get it to fit on the page as well. Following Audubon is a lot easier because he kept pretty good track of where he was, and a lot of the sites that he visited are still available today. I was really fortunate just before COVID hit to go down to the Keys and to Dry Tortugas to follow in Audubon's footsteps. Jerry and Linda Lawrence took me out to Indian Key to see an island that he actually visited and spent some time there. And Jerry is the head ornithologist for Audubon, Florida now. And he has been doing extensive research on flamingos and on the roseate spoonbill population, and has been heavily involved in Everglades restoration projects, because part of that is restoring water flow that birds need for their native habitat. I got to take a fabulous seaplane ride over to Dry Tortugas, and the picture at the bottom right simply does not give you the full experience of seeing just thousands and thousands of terns and other birds that are nesting on the shores of these small islands off of Dry Tortugas. There's always a lot of birders there, and I always stand and think about, we're looking at what Audubon saw. It's really fun. John Muir came to Florida before he became John Muir. We always associate John Muir with Yosemite National Park and as the founder of the Sierra Club. But long before he was there, he came to Florida. And it's an interesting story how he came here. He had been a young man who had been working as an inventor. He actually had quite the inventor's mind. And he'd been working in a factory, and a file slipped and hit him in the eye. And it blinded him in one eye. Within 24 hours, his other eye also quit working as a result, we think, of sympathetic blindness. And while he was lying in a darkened room with bandages on his eyes, which was the only known cure, Muir makes a deal with God. And he says, if I get well, I'm finally going to take a big expedition, and I'm going to go south. I'm going to walk to Florida, and then I'm going to catch a boat and go to South America. He manages to do that. He's fortunate, his eyesight comes back, and right then he starts planning an expedition. He's in his late 20s, and just like Bartram, he's very interested in plants. So he carries with him a small bag of goods and a plant press, and basically has 2 sets of clothes, and decides that he's going to literally walk from Indiana all the way south. So he keeps a journal as he goes along the way. Here's a sample of it. I love on the left, he identifies himself in the early pages of the journal as John Muir, Earth, Planet, Universe. This is not your normal visitor to Florida in this period of time. And he leaves in 1867, and as he chronicles his trip, he also does drawings. And as you can see here, he was fascinated with Florida palm trees. He also loved the magnolias. I have to mention that too. And you can see his journals online at the Sierra Club if you would like to look at them from that point of view. But you can also read about them in the book, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. It was published after his death, and he was still editing it, but it really gives you an idea of a young man's thinking and his growing awareness and curiosity about the human place in the world. He really comes to believe that nature and humans are all God's creations, and that they deserve equal footing, that the humans shouldn't be in charge, that we are all part of this wonderful, marvelous universe that God has created. Muir gets to Savannah, where he takes a steamboat to Fernandina, Florida, and begins his trek through Florida at the very end of the book. It's October, and he gets off the boat, and the first thing he does is he buys a loaf of bread and settles down under a tree to take a nap. In his journal, he writes, I am now in the hot gardens of the sun, where palm meets pine, longed and prayed for and often visited in dreams. And he actually takes a nap, and suddenly hears a very loud noise, and of course wakes up and thinks, it's an alligator. I mean, this is what he was hoping to see. But alas, it was just a large white bird that startled him. And he's very funny about admitting, he really had that all wrong. But he really, again, exults in the Florida wilderness as he sees it. This is post-Civil War, southeastern United States, and Muir witnesses a lot of destruction along the way. He meets would-be robbers along the road. He actually has 2 people try to rob him, and then they realize he's not carrying anything that they could possibly want, and so they leave him alone. And I think actually being a botanist also made him less dangerous to some people. He's spent the night at people's homes. He was given free food along the way. And so his visions of what the Southeast looked like after the war is really interesting as well. In Florida, as you can imagine, it would be difficult to get through on foot. So he used the rail lines, which at this period of time are not running. They are going to be reconfigured long after the Civil War. But he used the rail lines because if you think about it, they're wide open, right? You can cut through a lot of country. And he basically walks from Fernandina down to Gainesville, and then across the state to Cedar Key. And in Cedar Key, we almost lose John Muir. He comes down with malaria and is nursed back to health. It took 3 months for him to get nursed back to health. And so we almost lost the John Muir that we know now, and he would have died in Cedar Key. So it's a really fascinating account. He talks about as he approaches Cedar Key, he can smell the salt air, and it reminds him of his childhood in Scotland. And it's really a beautiful piece. I think we've all had that feeling, right? When you smell the salt water as you approach it. Going back to follow Muir is easy, but kind of frustrating because the rail lines have changed. Many of those lines are now roads, but I was lucky enough to have a couple of fun encounters. Merrill Clark on the top left works in Gainesville at one of the nature centers there, and he regularly impersonates Muir. So this is him in John Muir garb. He even has the beard, carrying a plant press, over his shoulder. And he has walked most of Muir's Trail in Florida, which now is mostly highways. Those old rail lines have become highways. So in the center and on the top right, you can see I got a group of friends of mine together in Gainesville, and we walked a few miles along the former rail path that is now a Rails to Trail walking path in Gainesville. So that was our piece of following Muir as well. On the bottom left, I'm with my photographer, Bruce Hunt, who did all the photos in the book. And we're at one of our favorite places in Cedar Key, which is the Island Hotel Bar, which has this great mermaid and merman mural behind it. And on the bottom middle, you can see this is a group of my students that I took to Cedar Key last year, and we walked to the very end of where the rail line would have crossed over the island. The bridge is no longer there, but we could stand and imagine what Muir saw as he approached Cedar Key, as he smelled the salt air and appreciated one of the sunsets as well. Another great trip I find fascinating is the Ingraham Everglades expedition of 1892. It was led by James Ingraham, who at the time was working for H.B. Plant, who was of the Plant Railroad line. Later, he would go to work with the Flagler Rail line as well. But in this period of time in 1892, they had a great scheme. Let's draw a straight line from Fort Myers to Miami to install a telegraph line and or perhaps a rail line. What a great idea. So they outfitted themselves, 22 men with 2 wooden skiffs, canoes, tents, equipment, and they were sure that they could make a straight line. And they were surveying, and they were sure they could make a straight line across South Florida and good all in 12 days. Well, they hadn't done much research. They hadn't talked to any native people, and they were making a lot of big assumptions. And I think part of the lure of all of this is the idea that Florida at this time is still a vast wilderness area. It was compared to darkest Africa as an unknown place that hadn't been well charted. And we are now dealing with this kind of explorer ideal that I can do it, I can make it happen. One of the expedition members, and interestingly, there's at least 3 accounts that come back from this expedition, but Alonzo Church really felt like, that was this, well, I love this quote. He says, it held the glamour that unexplored regions shroud themselves in, and which to an ardent fancy have all the attractions that imagination can bring forth. The opportunity of joining an expedition for exploring this region was therefore eagerly embraced, despite the advice of friends who had been upon the border of this country and the wishes of relatives that I should not run the risks of such an undertaking. Well, it was risky. And within a few days, they had abandoned their idea of doing the surveying. They could not get their boats to float across the Everglades because, as you probably know, the Everglades aren't pure water. There's a lot of sawgrass and shallow areas and mucky areas and islands as well. And so basically, they got out of their boats and had to push them with the equipment in them. They ran out of food pretty quickly. There was one account that said if they hadn't stepped on some turtles, they would not have had dinner that night as well. And so they were in pretty bad shape. Finally, they do manage to run across a Seminole man who gives them finally directions of how to get to downtown Miami, and they are saved. And they were thrilled when they reached what had recently been Fort Dade, the outpost in Miami that now Julia Tuttle had turned into her home. You can't really see much there now. There's a little bit of remnants of Tuttle's home along the Miami River, and on the right you can see there's a bronze plaque to her. She's the woman in the apocryphal tale that a lot of people don't think is really true, who supposedly sent a branch of orange blossoms to Henry Flagler after the big freeze of the 1890s and said, "You should come to Miami, it doesn't freeze here." Whatever, Flagler did extend his rail line to Miami and then toward Key West as well in this period of time. Trying again to follow this route is difficult without an airboat across the Everglades, and we're really not sure exactly where they were. A lot of people have attempted it, but along the way there's some beautiful birds, and it was a lovely place to retrace. Zora Neale Hurston is now recognized as one of the most prominent African-American writers of the 20th century. Hurston grew up in Eatonville, Florida. She claimed it was her hometown, but it wasn't. She also claimed a lot of things like her age. She changed that whenever it was helpful. But she said she learned in Eatonville, Florida, about the stories that the men told in the local store. And she was fascinated by their tall tales and fables that they would tell. And all her life, this was something that fascinated her, and she made a career off of it. She became a prominent member of the Harlem Renaissance. And during this period of time, she manages to get a degree from Barnard College in anthropology. And part of her anthropological work was to go and collect stories among the Black populations in the South. And she does that in a remarkable way. I find her to be just this fascinating character, a chameleon, who could fit herself into many different situations and always come out, doing well. So she could be in a Barnard classroom, or she could be sitting in a logging mill talking to employees and still get along just fine with everybody. When you come to Eatonville today, not much still exists. The old store where the men told their tall tales, the home where she grew up, are all gone. The coming into town, you'll see a big archway, and on the pillar of the archway is this lovely plaque to her. On the bottom left, you'll see there's the Mosley House. It's about the last house that's still standing that she once visited. And on the top left is a basketball court that has been done in the city. I just love that mural as well. However, Eatonville has an annual festival for her every January. It's really popular. It's part online and part in person, and where they have celebrated her for many years now. And the whole city just comes alive celebrating this daughter of theirs as well. She, during some of her research, Hurston lived with and interviewed workers at two really fascinating places. One was at a turpentine camp that was called the Shamrock area, which is now basically Cross City in western Florida. It was a horrible, horrible job. The people were kind of in economic slavery. You cut into trees, you collected their sap, and then it was processed in a big mill. Many of the camps were surrounded by fence, and they were you got in debt to the company store and you never got out of it. Hurston was sent ahead of a group of WPA writers who wanted to interview these and tape record these workers in the camp, but she was sent out first to make friends, and so that when the white crew showed up, then they would feel comfortable talking to them. I took my class again up here last fall. All we could find was a sign that said Shamrock, and there's like a Hardee's there, and the Dollar General across the street. So we stopped and had our picture made. And I had them read her accounts of the turpentine mill. It was fascinating. She also wrote extensively about the lumber mill that she went to visit down in today's Polk County. It was the Everglades Cypress sawmill. When she showed up, she was in a brand new car and a brand new dress, and the workers immediately would not talk to her because they were sure that she must be a federal revenuer. So she had to convince them quickly that no, she made up a story that it was her boyfriend's car and she was on the lam because he was a moonshiner and they were in trouble. So the workers took her in and she lived in their housing. She collected stories, folk tales, music, poetry. She partied with them. I mean, she really collected, again, stories that I think if it hadn't been her, I don't think we would be having them today. And I think we would be a much more boring community without them. While many of the sites are missing in Eatonville, Fort Pierce, Florida has done a really good job of preserving some Zora sites. It began in the 1980s when the author Alice Walker traveled to Fort Pierce looking for Hurston's grave in an all-black cemetery and realized it had never been marked. So she traipsed around in the weeds and decided that the sunken piece of land in the cemetery must be Hurston's, and so she paid to have it memorialized. Today you can see in the middle, it's been, there's a headstone, there's a marker that the city has put there as well, and on the left is a marker as you come into the cemetery that memorializes her as well. When I've been there, there've been different food offerings, bottles of whiskey, cigarettes, different things there. So it's really become a sense of a pilgrimage site as well. On the right is the house where she lived in near the end of her life. She was working on a manuscript about the life of Herod the Great, which actually was just published in January. So she's still a published author. And she rented and then was living rent-free at the behest of a family. He was a doctor who was friends with her family and helped take care of her in her later years. You may see here that there's some markers in front of these two sites. The city of Fort Pierce has put together a Dust Tracks Heritage Trail, which has multiple sites that you can go and see where Hurston visited in the city of Fort Pierce. They have really taken her on as one of their sisters. This is in the bottom picture. You can see this is the nursing home where she died. She had a really bad stroke and had to go to the all-black nursing home at the time and later died of another stroke. But a community group has gotten together, including Marvin Hobson, who's in the picture on the left, and they have gotten a grant from the state and they plan to open it later this year as a museum, not just to Hurston, but to the whole African-American community. Because as some of you may know, when Hurston was in Fort Pierce, she was teaching part-time at the all-black high school, and some of her students turned out to be highwaymen painters. So that's another interesting story. And the Fort Pierce has also put together a highwayman trail that you can follow as well. So there's a really rich history that they want to celebrate in Fort Pierce. And they will be having a festival on April 5th in Fort Pierce, another Zora festival. So man, she's having lots of parties long after her death. I'm going to wrap up tonight by talking about Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, who is an author very near and dear to my heart. I have to throw a disclaimer in here that I'm on the board of trustees for the Marjorie Rawlings Society because I am such a big fan of her writing. And her life is such an interesting story of, again, a person who comes to Florida without knowing much about it and falls completely in love with it. She and her husband, Charles, had been journalists in Rochester, New York. She'd been writing a serialized column called Poems of the Housewife or Songs of the Housewife. She wrote a daily poem. It was kind of sad. She wasn't a very good housewife, but she did well writing her poems. But she and Charles had another dream. They wanted to find a way that they could live and pursue the writing interests that they had. At the time, Marjorie was wanting to write Gothic novels from Europe. After she gets a large inheritance, they take a chance and they buy sight unseen a wooden farmhouse in Cross Creek, Florida, which is between Gainesville and Ocala. It was in terrible shape. It was in shambles, but it was surrounded by 70 acres of orange groves. And what they hoped was that these orange groves were going to produce enough fruit and income that they could just live the writing life. Well, anybody who's lived in Florida long enough knows that gambling everything on an orange grove is not a good idea. And within 3 years, she had lost most of her inheritance. But she had found her literary nirvana. She started writing and talking to the local people in the area, became entranced with the whole area, and fell in love. And from that, she produced a wealth of literature. This is the picture of the house today, which has been restored and is now part of a state park. I highly recommend it if you haven't been there. It's still got a lot of the original furniture that she had. And on the porch, they have the table that Charles made for her and a manual typewriter. She used to sit on this screened-in porch and type, and the neighbors said they could hear her typing. She also had a bed there so she could she could rest during the heat of the day. But it's a really wonderful trip to go and imagine her being there. Her very first book was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, but the book that really got the nation's attention was The Yearling. It was published in 1938 and wins the Pulitzer Prize the next year. This is a picture of the manuscript that is now up at the University of Florida. All her papers are in the archives there. But it gives you an idea of kind of old school writing, right? When we typed, we hand edited, and then we taped pages together. But gives you an idea of the beginning of her lovely book, The Yearling. That's taken, and she uses stories that she took from the local people in it, and she readily admitted it. She had met a man who had a baby deer as a pet as a child. And she had met people who had been on bear hunts. There's a big bear hunt in the middle of the book as well. So she was using her journalism to inform her books as well. And she had a real ear for dialogue and would spend months staying with families to collect their stories, and they readily welcomed her in. So I find that fascinating too, is this New York lady who shows up, who's got this fancy car and she's got this house, but she is welcomed into their homes and eats meals with them and listens to their stories. Another very popular book that she published in 1942 is Cross Creek, which is a semi-autobiographical account of her time in Cross Creek. She talks about the different people of the creek. She talks about different adventures she goes on. And one of those adventures has inspired me for many, many years. It's the Hyacinth Drift chapter from that book, in which she and her friend Desi decide they're going to take a trip up the length of the St. Johns River. Desi, who I was able to interview and write about, said that they'd been drinking moonshine that night, and Marjorie was really depressed. Charles was leaving her. They were going to have a divorce. This had turned out to not be the place Charles wanted to be. He ended up being a yachting writer, believe it or not. And Cross Creek, he was not happy there. She was having, Rawlings was having writer's block about a book that she was working on, and was just not happy. And so after some drinks that night, Desi says, well, I know what we need to do. We need to take a trip on the St. Johns River. It's what I've always wanted to go do. And she said the next day Rawlings called her and tried to back out, but she said, nope, too late. I've already got plans in motion. I got my boat getting ready, and we're going to go do this. So in March, 1932, they take off on the St. Johns River and spend a week on the river. I went back and retraced this trip with a girlfriend of mine for a magazine article, and then later went back in 2006 to retrace the trip for a documentary that I was working on with a nonprofit environmental group. We felt like the trip was a framework for helping people understand the value and the cultural beauty of the St. Johns River. And so we ended up making a PBS documentary. It aired across the United States. It was called In Marjorie's Wake. The painting on the left, I want to share with you because Jake Glisson painted this. Jake had been her neighbor. He'd been a little boy and knew Rawlings and knew Desi Smith as well. And he painted that for us. On the right is a still photo from the trip. As you can see, I'm driving the boat because I owned the boat and I could drive the boat. So that's how I ended up in a documentary, which was not my intent at all, but it was really fun. And I still hear people talk about it now. And it led me to a new career path. I ended up becoming an adjunct professor at Rollins College, and then got my PhD, and then ended up where I am now as a full-time professor at Rollins. So in many ways, Rawlings and I have been connected for many decades. She just doesn't know about it. Other chapters in the book that I didn't have time to get to tonight include following the Hernando de Soto expedition of 1539, In following where Harriet Beecher Stowe traveled on the Ocklawaha River in 1873, she wrote an amazing account of taking an overnight steamship up the Ocklawaha River to Silver Springs, which was the premier tourist attraction of the era. Stephen Crane, who wrote The Red Badge of Courage, who's shipwrecked off the Volusia County coast in 1897. And then a group of different writers who come through West Florida, including Laura Ingalls Wilder, who knew, who stays briefly in 1891, hoping to restore her husband Almanzo's health, but instead found that it wasn't the best place for them to be. So these are many accounts and many more details that I haven't had a chance to talk to tonight, but I hope that you'll enjoy them in the book. The purpose behind this book, I hope, is to inspire you. At the end of every chapter, there's a travel information in case you want to go see some of these sites, and I hope you will. And really, in doing this, I was trying to discover, can you still follow these writers? Can you still find some of the atmosphere that they offered you in their writings? And the answer is yes and no. The Atlantic coast does not look like what Jonathan Dickinson saw, but I wasn't feeling threatened. And you can still see some really wild places on the Ocklawaha River. So there's pieces of both along the way. So it's been a really fun journey for me, as well as I hope it will be a fun journey for you. And my greatest hope again is that once you get out and start seeing some of these places, that you'll care about them and want to help protect them. And Florida needs protecting. So thank you so much for your attention tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take some questions as well.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was totally amazing. I read your book, Saving Florida, Women's Fight for the Environment in the 20th Century, and I actually used that in one of my papers that I did in graduate school. So thank you for that. And we'll open it up for questions, but there are some in the chat, but we'll take the people if they want to go ahead and ask some questions now. You can unmute yourself if you'd like to talk. And if not, let's see what questions that we have in the chat. So Robert seemed to be very interested and asked several questions. The first one was, do they know the name of the native tribe that aided Dickinson?
They do, and I'm afraid I'll pronounce it incorrectly. It's spelled A-I-S, the ice or ace.
Right.
Is that correct? I don't know if that's correct. Y'all probably know better than I do. What's really fascinating about this group is that, well, two things. First of all, within 25 years, they were not there anymore. That was the only recorded European recording we have of this tribe. So what he wrote about, and he talked about going to ceremonies with them and watching them, interact, and what they ate and what they wore, is really the best information we have about them. The other interesting thing, I think, is that they understood European politics, because they knew that the English and the Spanish were fighting each other, and they had aligned themselves with the Spanish, and they traded with them. And so being an English person was a dangerous thing. So I think that it just goes to speak to the fact that they were far more worldly than we like to think or have thought about in the past.
Can I comment on one thing about that group?
Sure.
This is Dan Sure. I'm actually listening to you from Atlanta. But me and my father used to, back in the 1970s, we would fish in Hobe Sound. So if you go through the ritzy part of Hobe Sound, go up through Jupiter Island and follow A1A all the way up past the Hobe Sound Public Beach and keep going, the road ends. And there's we used to snook fish up there in the 1970s. And one of the things we used to do, nobody was there. So there were houses that had fallen into the ocean. There were really good fishing around those places, but we would walk 2 to 3 miles north from that public beach from where it stopped. And you get bored, and be just me and my dad, and you'd walk back up into the woods, and we found burial mounds back up in the mangroves. It had to be this group. And my dad used to comb the beach, and he said he was looking for He said he was looking for artifacts and he found a spearhead
Oh, wow.
and he framed it. And I still either I have it or my brother has it. And just, in the where you find shells in the right there in the surf. This was 3 miles north of the public beach in Hobe Sound. So it had to be that same group. But if I suspect that those mounds are still there, and because I don't think any of that's been developed. A1A is and Dixie Highway are west of that, but I don't think there's anything between the river and the ocean except mangroves up that way. If you go north of Hobe Sound, drive as far north on A1A as you can where it ends. But those have got to still be there. It was a long, long walk, and there was nothing but mangroves back up it.
Well, so now you're sending me on another field trip. Thank you.
Hey, it's a beautiful walk.
I imagine. But can you imagine 200 miles of that? I mean,
Oh
that's,
gosh, no,
yeah.
no. I watched the Barefoot Mailman thing a couple weeks ago too, and it was, yeah,
Thank you,
Yes.
Dan.
yeah.
That's great. So Robert also says, were the wolves that Bertram noted a unique species to Florida? Were they a subspecies of the Louisiana swamp wolf? I don't
Okay.
know.
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure about species and all, but we would now call them the Florida red wolf. They're highly endangered. There are a few remnant populations. There's one on St. Vincent Island off the Panhandle coast, and there was a group in South Carolina. They've tried reintroducing them, and so far, when they put them into larger recreation areas, they've been killed. So you can see them in zoos now, but they're really not wild anymore. But when Bartram came through, they certainly were, and it was part of the landscape. It was interesting to imagine.
And does anyone in the audience have additional questions? We have a few more in the chat. Was Zora a WPA funded writer?
Yes, she was working for the Florida Writers Project that was out of Jacksonville. Sorry, and they hired her to go in and, like I said, kind of prime the people in the turpentine areas. And she worked with Stetson Kennedy. Some of you may be familiar with Stetson, who was a wonderful Florida historian. So she went in and talked to the turpentine workers, and then Stetson came in with a tape recorder and tape recorded the stories of these people. And you can see all of this is online. It's available through the archives online. You can read the accounts yourself.
Amazing. And then another question is, was the Polk County logging camp near Lake Wales? There's a park called Sumica, and it related the story of a bygone logging operation on the grounds early 20th century.
So I'm told this was in a community called Loughmen, Loughman. I think a local told me it's Loughmen, which is now like a big Publix. Sadly, the rail line is still there, and it's right near the Osceola Polk County line. But I imagine there were a lot of sawmills in that area. Florida was basically logged over in the 30s and 40s, and that was a huge industry throughout the state as well. But her descriptions of, she went out and watched these guys cut down cypress trees and monstrous longleaf pines. And then she watched them in the mill, and then she partied with them at night, which they partied hard on the weekends. And this is how she gained their confidence and was able to access these wonderful stories.
And you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat.
Would you indulge all of you before you leave? Can I ask you to indulge me for just a moment? There is a passage that John Audubon wrote when he was in the Keys, and he observed a sunset. And I would like to share it with you, but I want to ask you all to, well, I don't know if we need to close our eyes, but imagine a sunset that you've seen, and let me read you his description and see whether you think he got it right. All right? Are we game? All right. Here's what Audubon had to say. If you have never seen the sun setting in those latitudes, I would recommend to you to make a voyage for the purpose. For I much doubt if, in any other portion of the world, the departure of the orb of day is accompanied with such gorgeous appearances. Look at the great red disk, increased to triple its ordinary dimensions. Now it has partially sunk beneath the distant lines of waters, and with its still remaining half irradiates the whole heavens with a flood of golden light, purpling the far-off clouds that hover over the western horizon. A blaze of refulgent glory streams through the portals of the west, and the masses of vapor assume the semblance of mountains of molten gold. But the sun has now disappeared, and from the east slowly advances the gray curtain which nigh draws over the world. I wish I had written that. But I can see that sunset, and I've seen that in the Keys, and I think it's wonderful to think that, you know, we've experienced the same marvelous glory that Audubon saw as well.
Well, thank you for sharing your amazing work with us. I really want to go follow. Barbara, did you want to end the meeting with anything? Okay, I will just once again say thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Dr. Poole, for sharing your information with us.
Well, thank you all. I hope you all find an adventure somewhere.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
The only thing I would add is to remind everyone to please respond to the survey and express your pleasure with Dr. Poole's presentation, please.
Thank you. And I guess